Spain, sun-drenched, storied, and steeped in centuries of layered tradition. By the twilight of the 15th century, it was more than a kingdom. It was a crucible of cultures, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews once coexisted in a delicate, often uneasy but undeniably productive balance. Within this dynamic realm thrived one of the world's most intellectually and spiritually rich Jewish communities, the Sephardim. These were poets, astronomers, physicians, merchants, philosophers, men and women whose identities transcended borders and whose ideas enriched an empire on the cusp of global influence. Synagogues rang with ancient liturgies, libraries swelled with translated texts from Arabic, Greek, and Hebrew, and markets pulsed with the commerce of East and West. But then came the year 1492, not just the year Columbus sailed across the Atlantic, but the year when Spain chose orthodoxy over openness. The Edict of Expulsion tore families apart, turned neighbors into exiles, and extinguished the golden light of Sephardic life in Iberia. But what if it didn't? What if 1492 marked not an ending, but a beginning of something greater? What if the Spanish Inquisition, with its fires and fear, never ignited? What kind of Spain would have emerged? What kind of world? Tonight, we step through that unchosen door, into a Spain that never silenced its scholars. A world where tolerance triumphed over tyranny. A question that changes everything. What if the Spanish Inquisition never happened? The word Spanish Inquisition still stirs something in the human psyche, a chill, a shudder, an echo of ancient dread. Not merely a historical event, but a symbol of ideological rigidity, where power cloaked itself in piety and fear became a national language. Instituted in 1478 under the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella, it began as a campaign to enforce Catholic orthodoxy, but quickly evolved into something far more insidious. This wasn't just about rooting out heresy, it was about control. A seismic restructuring of Spanish identity. A purging of plurality. With ruthless precision, the Inquisition dismantled centuries of multicultural coexistence. Jews, who had contributed to Spain's golden age of scholarship and commerce, were given an impossible choice: convert, flee, or perish. Muslims soon followed. And in their wake, Spain became more homogeneous, but at what cost? The Inquisition left scars on the land, on its people, and on its future. It hollowed out institutions of learning, stifled dissent, and drained the lifeblood of diversity that had once made Iberia a beacon of intellectual flourishing. The soul of a nation, once rich with voices, was reduced to a whispering monotone. But pause with me here, just for a moment, and imagine. What if this path had never been taken? What if Spain, at the crossroads of history, had chosen tolerance over tyranny? What if it had leaned into its cultural mosaic, allowing Christians, Jews, and Muslims to continue coexisting, creating, and elevating one another? In today's episode, we're stepping into an alternate past. A world where the Sephardic Jewish community was never silenced. Where the Renaissance in Iberia blossomed under the combined light of many traditions. Where the age of exploration was shaped not by a single vision, but by a chorus of diverse minds. This isn't just speculation, it's a reimagining of the possible. A look into a parallel history where the human story turned in a different direction. Are you ready to see what that world might have looked like? Let's begin where the silencing truly began, with the Sephardic Jews. In the tapestry of medieval Spain, they weren't merely a minority community, they were a vibrant thread interwoven through every aspect of life. They were the physicians who served monarchs, the translators who bridged Arabic wisdom with Latin curiosity, the financiers who stabilized the economy, and the scholars who debated the nature of the cosmos beneath candlelit ceilings. By the late 15th century, Sephardic Jews had already cemented their place as indispensable pillars of Iberian society. And yet, history chose to exile them. But what if that exile never came? In this alternate Spain, the great centers of Jewish learning in places like Lucena, Toledo, and Córdoba flourish without fear of persecution. The printing press, still a novelty in Europe, finds early adopters among Jewish scribes and scholars, ushering in a flood of multilingual texts. Hebrew, Arabic, and Latin ink the same pages, not as acts of defiance, but as celebrations of shared pursuit. Now imagine the ripple effects. Universities, free from doctrinal censorship, become crucibles of pluralistic thought. Sephardic philosophers debate Catholic theologians not in secret but on grand public stages, while Muslim mathematicians introduce advanced concepts of algebra and astronomy that accelerate Europe's scientific revolution by decades. In this Spain, knowledge isn't filtered through fear, it is forged in collaboration. And the cities, oh, the cities. Córdoba, with its libraries and mosaics of thought, rises once again as a northern Alexandria. Toledo, the city of three cultures, does not fade into the margins of memory, but rises to challenge Florence and Venice as a beacon of Renaissance brilliance. But this Renaissance, it's different. It doesn't merely resurrect the Greco-Roman past. It innovates, fuses, reinvents. A Sephardic Renaissance, bold and unrestrained, emerges not from the ashes of exclusion, but from the fires of mutual respect. Science, mysticism, medicine, and metaphysics all evolve not in parallel, but together. In this world, Europe's cultural and intellectual trajectory is not linear and uniform, it is layered, polyphonic, and dazzlingly diverse. Now ask yourself, what breakthroughs were lost when fear replaced curiosity? And what might we have gained in a world that chose inclusion? Now let's follow the money, not out of greed, but out of historical consequence. Because economics, like ideas, thrives on diversity. When the Inquisition took hold, it didn't just persecute souls, it plundered the foundation of Spain's economy. Jewish and Muslim families, many of whom had built transcontinental trade networks over generations, were expelled or forced into conversions that severed trust, shattered partnerships, and froze centuries of organic commercial growth. But imagine a Spain where that devastation never occurred. In this alternate world, the ports of Seville and Barcelona don't just ferry goods, they ferry innovation, ideas, and diplomatic possibility. Jewish financiers, with their deep roots in the Mediterranean trade routes and connections to North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and beyond, continue to serve as vital arteries in the economic body of Spain. Muslim artisans, engineers, and merchants lend their expertise to Spain's burgeoning industries. Christian nobles, rather than fearing competition, engage in cooperative enterprise. Together, these communities build a thriving, inclusive marketplace where wealth isn't hoarded but circulated. Gold from the New World is managed with wisdom and sustainability, not squandered on religious wars and absolutist fantasies. The influx of capital fuels education, infrastructure, and exploration, not inquisitorial courts. In this Spain, Seville could have become the Wall Street of the Renaissance, its docks teeming not just with ships but with languages, dialects, cuisines, and currencies. Barcelona, too, might have risen as a diplomatic and financial powerhouse, balancing Christian monarchies and Muslim sultanates through savvy negotiation and intercultural literacy. And here's the pivotal question. Could this economy, built on coexistence rather than exclusion, have saved Spain from the fate that ultimately befell its empire? In our timeline, the Spanish Empire grew vast, but hollow. It crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions. But in this alternate path, perhaps it endures not because of conquest, but because of cooperation. Not by suppressing difference, but by embracing it. A multicultural Spain might have given birth to a modern Europe centuries ahead of schedule. Just imagine what the world's balance of power would look like if the empire had been sustained not by sword and fire, but by shared prosperity. Let's now set our gaze westward to the New World. The Age of Exploration, a defining epoch that reshaped entire continents, was largely driven by European ambitions to claim, convert, and control. But what if the minds behind those ambitions had been different? Imagine a Spain whose colonial vision was not forged solely by monarchs and missionaries, but also shaped by Sephardic navigators, Muslim geographers, and philosophers fluent in ethics as much as in astronomy. A Spain that crossed oceans not just to conquer, but to connect. In this alternate timeline, Jewish scholars versed in diplomacy, trade, and international languages serve as emissaries to the Americas. Their approach is one of curiosity, not conquest. They see the indigenous civilizations not as obstacles, but as equals. And so, the first encounters between Europe and the Aztec, Inca, and Maya are transformed. Negotiations, not bloodshed. Exchange, not eradication. Perhaps the Spanish crown, advised by a more diverse and humane cabinet, recognizes the value of cultural preservation. Laws are passed early on to protect native governance, to integrate local knowledge into colonial systems, to build cities not on ruins, but in cooperation. Imagine the long-term effect of that. What if entire civilizations weren't annihilated, but evolved through cultural partnership? Mesoamerican mathematics, Incan engineering, European cartography, all blending into a new hybrid civilization grounded in mutual respect. And perhaps even more radically, imagine the moral conversations that might have emerged before the atrocities began. Sephardic voices, many of whom had faced religious persecution themselves, might have questioned the forced conversions of indigenous peoples. Muslim legal scholars, trained in diverse legal traditions, might have challenged the ethical foundation of slavery itself. Could the transatlantic slave trade, the deepest wound of modern history, have been curtailed before it metastasized into global tragedy? It's possible. Because in this version of history, empathy is not a weakness, it's a guiding principle. And so Spain's colonial empire, though still expansive, carries a different legacy. One not solely etched in conquest and conversion, but in dialogue, dignity, and diplomacy. It's a radical reimagining, but not an impossible one. All it would have taken was a different set of choices, and a willingness to see the world not as something to be dominated, but as something to be understood. To think the Spanish Inquisition only impacted Spain would be to underestimate its ripple across the continent. Intolerance, once given royal sanction and theological justification, spreads like wildfire. And so, the brutal machinery of persecution wasn't limited to Iberian soil, it became a dark template for others to follow. But now, shift the lens back to our alternate timeline. In this version of events, Spain chooses tolerance over terror. It becomes not the architect of religious persecution, but the antidote to it. Imagine, the same Spain that launched galleons across the Atlantic now launches a new social idea across Europe, a model of coexistence, power sharing, and pluralism. What then? France, embroiled in its own religious tensions, looks south not with suspicion, but with curiosity. Huguenots and Catholics don't descend into decades of war, they're offered a working model of religious symbiosis. England, instead of swinging violently between Catholicism and Protestantism, watches a tolerant Iberia and considers a more measured approach. Even the Holy Roman Empire, fractured and fragile, might draw inspiration from a unified Spain where religious difference isn't a threat, but a strength. Perhaps Martin Luther's protest still echoes through Wittenberg, but it's met with dialogue instead of bloodshed. The Reformation becomes more a reformation of ideas, and less a battlefield of creeds. And then there's the Enlightenment. In our real-world timeline, it emerged from the ashes of conflict and repression, a defiant light pushing back against centuries of darkness. But what if it didn't need to fight its way through? What if it had a foundation of tolerance already laid down 2 centuries earlier by a different Spain? The thinkers of the 17th and 18th centuries, Locke, Voltaire, Spinoza, might have built not just arguments for reason and liberty, but for inclusive humanism. The Enlightenment could have arrived earlier, not as a rebellion, but as an evolution. And perhaps its moral compass wouldn't have been compromised by the hypocrisies that haunted it, touting liberty, while nations still enslaved others. In this world, we see the Enlightenment not as a crack in the dam of repression, but as the flowering of a centuries-old tree rooted in Iberia, nurtured by diversity, and blooming across a continent. All because Spain chose a different path. One choice. One moment in time. And the world shifts. Now, let's turn the question over to you, the thinkers, the dreamers, the alternate historians among us. What do you believe would have unfolded if the Spanish Inquisition had never taken place? Would Spain have surged ahead as the most powerful, progressive empire of its time, driven not by dogma, but by diversity? Could it have become a model of religious tolerance that reshaped not just Europe, but the global order? A place where diplomacy triumphed over doctrine, and cultural fusion over forced assimilation? Or, perhaps you see a different twist in this timeline. Would tensions, left unresolved, have erupted in another form? Would coexistence have faltered under the weight of political ambition and human fear? Could the absence of the Inquisition have simply delayed the inevitable, shifting the storm elsewhere? This is the beauty and the challenge of alternate history. It asks us not just to imagine what could have been, but to confront the choices that were made. And to wonder how close we came to a very different world. So now it's your turn. Tell us, what's your version of history? Drop your thoughts, your theories, your own what-if spirals in the comments below. We're here to explore them with you, thought by thought, thread by thread. Let's rewrite history together. History isn't fixed. It's a web of choices, some made, some never taken. And while we often study the past to understand what was, there's an extraordinary power in asking, what might have been? The Spanish Inquisition did more than enforce religious orthodoxy, it severed the lifeline of cultural exchange, scientific progress, and human empathy that once pulsed through Iberia. It burned books, exiled minds, and silenced centuries of possibility. But here, in this thought experiment, we allowed ourselves to imagine another path. A path where that flame of tolerance was never snuffed out. Where dialogue triumphed over dogma. Where coexistence wasn't a dream deferred, but a daily reality. In doing so, we don't just reshape Spain, we rethink the very mechanisms of empire, identity, and progress. And perhaps most importantly, we challenge the idea that history was inevitable. So, if this journey has sparked a new way of looking at the past, if it's made you wonder how many other turning points might have led us somewhere different, then you're in the right place. This is what we do. We explore the strange intersections where history and imagination meet, where timelines split, and truths unravel into endless possibilities. So consider subscribing for more journeys into the unknown chapters of history. And if this episode made you think, made you feel, or made you pause, hit that like button and share it with fellow seekers of the what if. Because together, we're not just learning history, we're rewriting the story. Until next time, stay curious, stay bold, and never stop wondering, what if?